Welcome to another episode of Earth911's Sustainability in Your Ear. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe, your host, and we are back with another innovator interview. We were intrigued a few weeks ago when we read a study from the Energy Systems Integration Group about the prospects for green hydrogen in the post-carbon economy. The report is called Increasing Electric Power System Flexibility, the Role of Industrial Electrification and Green Hydrogen Production. And we'll include a link in the article that goes with this podcast so you can find that and read it for yourself. But we're talking today with Aidan Tuohy of the Electric Power Research Institute, that's EPRI or EPRI. He was the lead author on the report, and his colleague, Jeffery Preece, who is Director of Low Carbon Resources Research and Development at EPRI, and which is an independent nonprofit that was created in the public interest to address energy and environmental research gaps back in the 1970s. Hydrogen energy has a bad name. Many people just associate it immediately with nuclear weapons because of the hydrogen bomb, but it's a clean burning fuel in its gaseous and liquid forms that can replace fossil fuels in a variety of applications. However, even though burning hydrogen produces no pollution, you only get water after you burn it as part of the exhaust. It's a carbon-intensive fuel to produce in all but one form, which is known as green hydrogen. To make rapid progress toward electrification, we must also consider how the electric grid and energy infrastructure will need to change to support the use of hydrogen. So let's look into the path to green energy. You can learn more about EPRI at www.epri.com. Welcome to the show, Jeffery and Aidan. How are you today?
Doing great. Thanks for having us.
Well, glad to have you here. And so let me just start off with a very broad question about hydrogen. Where does hydrogen in general fit into the decarbonization solutions we need to launch over the next couple of decades? What percentage of our power needs to shift to hydrogen by 2040, say?
Well, Mitch, thank you for that question. And it's one we're wrestling with at EPRI and with our stakeholders in the energy community quite forcefully, because in some aspects, we see hydrogen as great potential for enabling decarbonization in very hard to abate parts of our economy. Mm-hmm. So where we won't be able to electrify, or there isn't a low-cost clean energy resource already identified, hydrogen, because it is already commercially available, not quite at the cost that we would need at such large-scale use, mm-hmm. It certainly is an interesting energy carrier for us to be focused on. So our analysis looking out into 2040 and 2050 suggests that we still need to do and continue to invest a tremendous amount of energy and resources into wind and solar and nuclear and hydro, electric sources that already today provide stable and low carbon electricity for the grid, matched with energy storage, of course, because there are capacity challenges with the wind and the sun, and just making sure that we always have clean energy, clean electricity available. So the role of hydrogen in the electricity grid is partly as a means to potentially offset when we don't have wind and solar assets operating, mm-hmm. But also when maybe during seasonal events where we get periods of time, days with low wind capacity, or days with low sun coming through and providing solar power, that there's a potential for hydrogen there. There's also potential for hydrogen to serve as peak load, where maybe there's periods of the day in the summer months or the winter months where additional electricity is needed only for a short period of time. But in a sense, hydrogen may not be the silver bullet to all of those challenges. In fact, there are a number of energy storage technologies and capabilities with our electric grid that could enable more deep decarbonization through the electricity sector. And so our focus is not trying to pick any winners or losers. It's really to identify, if the goal is to have a decarbonized energy economy that's reliable and affordable and available to everyone, how do we get there equitably and consciously without disrupting energy services as we expect them to be today. So it's not a direct answer, unfortunately, because we're still, as I said, wrestling with the concepts, but certainly there could be a role for hydrogen in helping us when we have a need for electricity that renewable energy or other sources just aren't available.
It's interesting. On the one hand, what you're describing is we're moving from a monoculture in our energy systems, fossil fuel centric, to one where it will be much more varied and resilient because there's so many different forms of energy generation and storage available. But you used an important phrase a moment ago, which is energy carrier. We don't typically think of our energy as being as converting it into one form to store it in order to then make what you used to create the storage medium. So we use a lot of electricity to split hydrogen or split water in order to make hydrogen fuel. Now, the difference here is that you will, unlike oil, where you would make various derivatives of oil, ultimately to burn it to release the energy, we will actually make a storage medium, hydrogen, from electricity, and then later turn it back into electricity. That adds a lot of dynamics to the environment and the infrastructure. So can you talk a little about how we are going to use hydrogen, particularly to store energy and potentially move it? What would we need to do to the infrastructure to rethink how we distribute energy in this environment?
Well, fortunately, we have a fair amount of infrastructure in place in the US already, which could conceivably be repurposed or upgraded, if you will, to facilitate a small use of hydrogen. It's a very small amount. It depends on the materials and the operations of pipelines and storage equipment, if you will. But in these early days of our transition to a potentially large hydrogen economy, we have the capability to slowly introduce hydrogen kind of into the mainstream of the energy world, if you will. And so what we're trying to work out, and I'm using a global we here,
Sure.
When and how do we make bigger investments in hydrogen specific infrastructure? So as we get into areas where hydrogen is a pure fuel for use, either in power generation or in industrial sector and transportation. And just as an aside, we actually see hydrogen's role playing a bigger part in non-power generation aspects of decarbonization, because we're very, very fortunate to have so many electric power generation options that are already of the low carbon variety. But from an infrastructure perspective, there's a lot of work going on to understand at a very large scale, because as you mentioned, right now, fossil fuels, about 80% of our final energy consumption. We've got pipelines, we've got storage above ground, underground. We've got infrastructure that's had century plus of investment and know-how and operations experience. We've got a fair amount of experience in the US, particularly in Texas and Louisiana and along the Gulf Coast there, with handling and moving hydrogen just at a much smaller scale. So there are a number of activities going on. The US Department of Energy is funding quite amount of research on blending and converting existing infrastructure to be capable of handling hydrogen. But also there's a lot of geological exploration happening to evaluate salt caverns, which could store years worth of hydrogen and take advantage of low cost electricity to produce that hydrogen and then store it underground at large scale so that we could use that over time. Again, there's a seasonal aspect from an electric power's perspective, but largely what we need to, in my opinion, really be focused on when it comes to hydrogen are the regional aspects of decarbonization, and where hydrogen plays a role helping a region or a cluster of industries decarbonize, in addition to efforts that include energy efficiency, electrification, even carbon capture and storage. As many technologies, as many approaches that we can enable, hydrogen will play one role in that, depending on if we limit or accelerate technology options. But really, hydrogen, if we don't want to get too narrow-minded in evaluating it as a silo for any one sector or any one use, because it is an expensive fuel to make today. There are many efforts to drive down those costs, but largely the storage and delivery of hydrogen as a fuel is rather complex, and there's costs associated with that. But it's not unique in that there are many aspects of our economy that could use hydrogen to decarbonize. And so bringing stakeholders together to evaluate these technologies and evaluate hydrogen's role compared to other technologies is going to be really important to understand exactly how much we might need to invest in that new infrastructure and where we deploy hydrogen across the country, because many states, many regions will be approaching this quite differently.
So, for instance, we could replace coal in steel furnaces for using hydrogen. Just so, you could imagine, for instance, the steel industry in the Midwest getting together and creating a hydrogen resource in some form through investment in order to use that in their industry, and then that creates a stepping stone to other applications.
Absolutely.
And that's how hydrogen becomes more common.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's already proving to be economical in some places of the world. Particularly, they're looking at this closely in Europe, replacing their fossil fuel resource in steel production with hydrogen. And what that will likely enable is if the price of steel, which translates to the price of a vehicle, going up, the marginal cost increasing only ever so slightly. So if a car made with hydrogen produced steel, the price increases maybe a couple $100. Is it a big deal? Maybe not. Maybe it get washed away. You're in the grand scheme of the cost of the vehicle. But in a sense, it helps decarbonize an entire sector, which already emits a fair amount of CO2. Having that regional focus then enables hydrogen to be considered for other aspects, because if the steel industry in a particular state or a region is making the investment to bring hydrogen in, the marginal cost to add more users, to add more production, will likely go down as we see economies of scale. This happens in
the network effect.
Right, a network effect, sure.
So tell us about the different types of hydrogen. The names reflect the source of hydrogen and the energy used to refine it. What's the difference between green, blue, and other hues of hydrogen that our listeners need to be paying attention to find the greenest options as they're looking at their decisions in the future?
There certainly is a lot of talk around classifying hydrogen. And what's really important to remember in these classifications and these color codes is the impact on the CO2 emissions. So green normally means the hydrogen is produced from a clean or renewable energy resource. So solar, wind, hydro producing electricity, that electricity directly, not necessarily through the grid. And this is where policy is finding its way, especially in countries across Europe today. None such in the US yet, but directly using clean renewable energy electricity for producing that hydrogen via electrolysis in most cases. Then you get into other colors. So pink would be a direct use of nuclear power to provide energy to the hydrogen production. In a sense, it's not really any different than green from a carbon molecule basis, both still producing either electrons or, in the case of nuclear, potentially heat through steam to drive the hydrogen production process. And then other aspects of the colors start to represent the carbon intensity, where CO2 emissions from producing the energy is greater than zero. So blue means, in most cases, you have a fossil fuel feedstock like natural gas, which applies carbon capture and storage rather than emitting that CO2 into the air. And so in the case of blue hydrogen, you're taking natural gas, methane, you're adding steam, water, and you're pulling the hydrogen off of the carbon atom in the methane molecule and capturing that hydrogen and using it. And then that carbon molecule likes to go to turn into carbon dioxide. But before that's emitted into the atmosphere, you're capturing that in a CO2 process and then sequestering it. Now, the real goal here is not so much to say, well, which one could be better. Clearly, minimizing CO2 emissions is important, but there's also facts of cost, of infrastructure, of applying where we already have natural gas resources matched with potential for CO2 sequestration to enable a clean hydrogen economy. Most of the carbon that's emitted in a blue hydrogen production process can be captured, but not 100% of it likely. There's
It's still lower carbon, but it's
still
not
lower
carbon
carbon,
free.
but not zero carbon in most cases. Yeah. And then there's other color combinations and hues, but we prefer to focus on that carbon intensity. So if you look at what, let's say, the US Department of Energy is put out as a metric, that's $1 per kilogram in the next decade, the 111 goal, they're basing that on a clean energy transformation that doesn't actually exclude the use of fossil fuels, but it's actually establishing very clear metrics to reduce the CO2 emissions. Because the challenge with using an energy resource like solar and wind and hydro to make these clean electrons to produce green hydrogen, so to speak, is that the market for those electrons is stronger than the market for hydrogen. And the cost to make that hydrogen is higher than the cost for how hydrogen is made today, which is primarily using natural gas without carbon capture and storage. So there are many areas, regions around the world that are kind of focusing in on this, pushing to isolate their renewable energy resources, their renewable electricity to make hydrogen and put that into a market. And they're having to do that at extremely large scale on the gigawatts of electricity production to drive those costs of hydrogen down to be competitive with other resources. So we have to take into account the goal is to decarbonize. How we get there is impacted by when or how we limit technologies. And so we believe it's really important not to limit a technology option, an energy resource like hydrogen, simply because it needs to be, quote, green. There are ways and there are methods to still decarbonize quite significantly and faster and at a cost that's better for everyone if we have as many technologies available as possible.
So we could continue to use natural gas, for instance, as a feedstock to create hydrogen and still do that in a low carbon or perhaps someday no carbon way if we can capture and sequester everything. But for the time being, looking for a green hydrogen option is simply to express you want one that is zero carbon emitting, and that suggests it's coming from renewable energy or nuclear in the case of pink, that doesn't emit any carbon in the process. We've talked with a lot of solar advocates on the show in the past, and they always talk about the need for batteries. In a way, hydrogen is a form of a battery that could be placed in large solar farms or wind farms as a local store to back up the power that is not being consumed when it is produced. Is this a radically different electric grid than we look at today, or is it, to what your point earlier, something that we are simply going to transform what we currently have, although sometimes the electricity will move in a liquid or gaseous form, potentially through a pipeline or in a truck? I'm having a lot of challenges trying to simplify this to explain it to folks. How would you characterize the future of our electric grid when it is well augmented with hydrogen?
Yeah, so that's been a lot of the focus of the ESIG report and a lot of the work we do in the area I'm in around renewable integration, because when you look in that future, particularly as you see more, say, wind and solar coming into the system, hydro, maybe nuclear, the issue of flexibility of the system becomes very important. So obviously we want to be able to store the energy and use it when it's actually needed. Wind and solar don't always line up very well with the actual need for electricity. So one of the things really that there does seem to be a lot of promise in with hydrogen or other forms of industrial electrification, but hydrogen in this specific case is around being able to use that excess wind and solar. So right now there's excess wind and solar, but smaller duration batteries where they can store for a few hours tend to be sufficient to kind of move that around. Mm-hmm. But if we're moving to a system where, let's say, you get 50, 60, 70% of your energy across the year coming from wind and solar, well, there's going to be a piece of that year when you've got way more than 100% of your energy that could potentially come from wind and solar, and other parts of the year when you'll have very low amounts. So even when you look across the entire country, there's still likely to be times when the wind is relatively low, there's less solar, it's cloudy, and maybe the demand is relatively high. So you want to be able to kind of shift that energy, and hydrogen is one of the potential ways to do that in a number of ways. One would be just using wind and solar to create the hydrogen during those other periods when it is excess, and then using in other industries like we've talked about. But then there is potential as well that you might have that last few percent in particular of your energy mix coming from something where you've created hydrogen, stored that, and then use that later on to provide peaking power. Obviously, it all becomes an economic question, and as Jeffrey was saying, there's other potential technologies as well. But really what we're talking about here generally is the need for flexibility, and it's flexibility to move energy across, or electricity across hours and days. But increasingly, we're going to see that need to be flexible across seasons and maybe even years. So that's really where there's a potential for these types of technologies that compete with other technologies that are coming out. But that's what we see that the real value is, that flexibility that they're providing.
So what are some of the industrial uses that you expect hydrogen to make its early and most significant impacts? What's the transformative moment where an industry says, we really can rely on hydrogen as opposed to fossil fuels?
Well, we're already seeing this happen in the global steel market, and a lot of what we're seeing is driven by the energy security perspectives in Europe, moving away from natural gas as a feedstock and heat source, along with coal, to hydrogen, which in the region, and I guess more broadly within Europe, is not quite at the scale and at the cost to sustain the industry per se, but not too far away in the Gulf region, Middle East, there are a number of countries putting significant investments in and already producing hydrogen and developing a hydrogen-based market for steel to supply European steelmakers with either feedstocks or energy to make this transition happen. We're also seeing that in marine transportation, there's a very strong interest to quickly identify new bunkering fuels to get away from fossil fuel resources. And hydrogen is one which could be used similar to your example with oil. When we extract oil, there's a number of chemical processes which convert that petroleum product into other byproducts. Hydrogen is a building block molecule. Mm-hmm. So in marine transportation, they're looking at the potential to take that hydrogen, add a nitrogen molecule and another hydrogen molecule and create ammonia. And that could be used as a fuel to power large marine vessels. They're also looking at hydrogen as a potential feedstock and building block to create methanol. Both ammonia and methanol are widely used, widely transported, very well understood. Infrastructure is there worldwide, but we're talking about significant scale building up. So there are a number of areas in that space where using hydrogen, as I said, as that building block to create another product which is used, that could be feasible. Of course, every step, every transformation or conversion you take adds costs, and so right. There's a number of evaluations taking place, investments being evaluated to see are these potential pathways viable and what might be needed to enable them at lower cost. Beyond that, we'll see again where it's really hard to electrify. And electrification is not a pathway to decarbonization. Areas like drying and process equipment and heating, where it's simply the temperatures needed are too high for electricity, or they're needed in time periods that electricity wouldn't serve their current processing times. Hydrogen could play a role as a heat source there. And then in other non-road vehicles, forklifts, cranes, things that, again, not impossible to electrify, but maybe not the most efficient means of decarbonization.
So we've often heard visions of hydrogen fuel cells for automobiles. It doesn't sound like you're expecting people to be pulling up to a hydrogen fuel station to fuel their EV in the near future. Is that something that is that just science fiction, or is that potentially something that people will encounter in the next decade or so?
Well, to me, it comes down to the cost to the consumer, because you and I have to make those decisions, every day as to how we plan our finances. And so what we're seeing is that the cost of battery electric vehicles has come down quite substantially and projected to continue. What's interesting is some of that driver is also helping drive down the cost of fuel cells, because there's a lot of commonality in the technology there. The challenge, though, with hydrogen fuel cell will be the fuel cost. And so, especially in the US, in many areas, the electricity cost is fairly low compared to other parts of the world. Hydrogen production still very nascent, especially in markets like transportation. It's going to take a bit longer for hydrogen fueling costs to catch up, and maybe could never catch up. Where we see hydrogen fuel cells playing a role in transportation could be in more heavy duty applications, in long haul, where buses, right, where charging or battery swapping, or again, just kind of managing the consumption of energy at a higher rate isn't feasible through electricity.
So I read that the Energy Transitions Commission estimates that we need about a $15 trillion investment to make a complete hydrogen transition, which doesn't mean it takes over everything, but that it takes its appropriate role in the new economy. What are the major features of the new grid that we're going to have to build? We've talked a lot about the individual existing components that can be repurposed, but what are the new technologies that we might be hearing about as we make this transition?
So from the power grid side of things, or from the system side of things, I think we're trying to understand. It's clear as we look at the grid in general, hydrogen or not, that we're going to need to build a lot more transmission to accommodate the changing resource mix, the renewables coming into the system. That's been a big push, obviously, recently to look at what additional transmission is needed and how we build out that transmission. But as we think about hydrogen specifically, then I think one of the things we're going to need to think about is how we're going to store and transport that hydrogen together with the electric grid. So it has to look at where will that hydrogen be produced, where will it be consumed. Ideally, as Jeffrey was mentioning, things like ammonia, that there might be some potential option to produce that and then ship it elsewhere. You do have the need for, you still are going to want to have some resilience and local reliability. So it's not always about, making things very far from where the actual demand is, but in some cases that might be the most economic option. So we will need to think about, new storage for the system. We'll need to think about where those resources that you actually create hydrogen and where you might consume it are, and do that in the context of that larger energy system where we're drastically changing a lot of the system, including transmission build out and distribution build out as well.
So one of the questions that we frequently get when people ask about hydrogen is, do you need a lot of water to make this? And you mentioned that we use steam, for instance, to make gray hydrogen, mixing it with with natural gas. Is water scarcity a concern, or can hydrogen be made from seawater, or does it need to be desalinated, which of course adds a step and cost to the end fuel? What role does water access play in the growth of the hydrogen economy, if any?
It's going to be really important, because the technologies used today rely on and require actually a very pure source of water to create hydrogen. Otherwise, the equipment would be damaged by the salts, the right, natural components that we find in water, even clean drinking water today. It's not pure enough. So it's got to get ultra pure. So certainly seawater or brackish water desalination, where there's less competition from a water resource, is possible. But then, of course, no system is perfect. You have to still manage the byproducts of that desalination process. So you clean the water by removing the salts and things in it that would be considered an impurity to the electrolyzer, but then you just concentrate them up. And so there's environmental aspects of managing those concentrated solutions, and that has an impact as well. But from a water availability perspective, using water to in the hydrogen production process is rather intensive, because you're taking it a little bit more than 1-to-1. So a water molecule to a hydrogen molecule, nothing is perfectly efficient. So you are using a fair amount of water in the process, which could be a limiting factor in areas where water security is a challenge. Now, the difference is we can't, again, much like we think about using hydrogen, producing hydrogen can't be viewed as in a vacuum and in a siloed nature of a region, because the transition to electrification, the transition to low carbon fuels like hydrogen could mean less water consumption in other aspects of our economy. And so when we do a very high level analysis of the potential impacts for water availability and water consumption, when we think about coal assets retiring, and they consume water primarily in their cooling processes, that amount of consumption per the energy that they produce is actually higher than the amount of water consumed for electrolysis, again, on an energy production basis. So it's a complicated factor. It's going to be very regional specific. And so it has to be very focused on, can you find, where you have water scarcity challenges, can you find water which is not in competition with other needs and other sources? And then, of course, so as you mentioned, you've got to tack on the costs to treat that water and then manage the residuals in that process.
Is there a country or a region making more aggressive investments that we can learn from? This is obviously going to be a regional solution. At least it's going to grow up from regions rather than from the top down and appear globally all at once. Who's doing this well, and what can we learn?
Well, there's a couple of really exciting areas kind of transforming as we speak. So the European Union, coming out of the COVID pandemic and looking at opportunities to ramp back up the economy, has been investing billions, and if not close to trillion a euro already in hydrogen related activities, tacking on now the energy security aspects with everything going on between Russia and Ukraine, certainly amplifying the potential for hydrogen and accelerating their interest across those countries. We're also seeing countries such as Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, who have come out and created their 2050 net zero plans, showcase that as part of that plan, a significant portion of their energy economy could depend on importing hydrogen from other areas. And they are already making investments and taking action to secure supply of low carbon hydrogen and transforming their economy inside those countries. And then Aidan and I actually just returned from the UAE, where we met with a number of folks from different Gulf countries there. And there's a number of projects in Saudi Arabia and Oman being discussed in UAE, where they're looking to, as I mentioned before, invest significantly in solar and wind resources and dedicating those to the production of hydrogen at such a massive scale, on a gigawatt scale, to produce hydrogen at a low cost and make it competitive within that market. And so there really is a lot of activity going on. Chile has announced significant investments in renewable energy to do the same, and they're looking to export their hydrogen or derivative product to Europe as well. So I'd imagine we're going to continue to see very country-specific opportunities, especially on the export side, because right now there's a lot of interest to produce lower cost hydrogen, but that's really driven based on who can produce electricity the cheapest. And that's where you get into these high penetration solar and wind areas. And then how can they find enough end users, enough of a market, if you will, to establish the necessary investment to make all of that happen?
This is such a broad topic, and we could talk about it for a long time. And unfortunately, we're running short on time. Can I ask you to share what advice you have for our listeners about how to encourage the companies and the governments they rely on to adopt hydrogen as an option within the fuel mix? Is there a clear way to send that message today?
Well, I would encourage everyone to continue seeking out answers to their questions and be educated. We're all in this process of educating ourselves, educating each other. We don't pretend at EPRI to have the answers to everything. We exist to push the boundaries of science and technology for society. And we recognize that society and the public in general have a need to be updated as well. So they can certainly find information on our websites, but there are many others. The U.S. Department of Energy has a tremendous amount of resources, basics around what hydrogen is and where it comes from and where it could be used. There are other groups like the American Institute of Chemical Engineers who have dedicated significant focus to the safety aspects of hydrogen and how we can safely use, and how we already are safely producing and storing and using hydrogen. And there you have universities and national labs and the brightest minds in our country coming together to ensure that hydrogen can be a safe, reliable fuel for decarbonization. And then there are even state agencies, local universities, very active. There's a tremendous amount of information already available. I think it's important for people to understand, no one's quite figured this out, and hydrogen will likely be playing a bigger role later in our transition to a net zero decarbonized future in that 2040 to 2050 range. Mm-hmm. But we have to start being comfortable with it now because we're going to blink and it's going to be time to make very significant investments and meet these very challenging goals.
And certainly the times call for some very significant action, and it's important that we think ahead so that we make the investments to get there. Jeffery and Aidan, I want to thank you both for taking time to talk with us today.
Thank you, Mitch. A pleasure.
We've been speaking with Aidan Tuohy and Jeffery Preece. They are both with the Electric Power Research Institute, EPRI or EPRI. And I encourage you to check out EPRI.com. That is a great resource to understand the changing mix of our energy infrastructure. It's going to be an amazing 20 or 30 years. Let's hope we get it right. If anything has come from the Ukrainian conflict, it is an interesting outcome. Vladimir Putin may have actually shot his basic industry in the foot by driving most of his customers towards alternatives to fossil fuels. Hopefully that's going to catalyze investments not only in Europe and throughout Asia to free themselves from fossil fuel dependency, but it will also create opportunities for the United States and all these countries to begin to compete in a new green economy with new fuels that are not damaging the planet every second that we burn them. So folks, take some time to learn about hydrogen and think about how it might fit into the world around you. We're going to have both Aidan and Jeffery back to talk about this more because there's so much to talk about. This is Earth911 Sustainability in Your Ear. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe, and we will be back, of course, with another innovator interview soon. In the meantime, take a few minutes to share this podcast and many of the others. We've done 286 as of this recording. There's a lot of information. We have more ideas, so let's create less waste by sharing them. We'll be back soon. In the meantime, take care of yourself, take care of one another, and let's all take care of this beautiful planet of ours. Have a green day.